Hello and welcome to All Aces on Air. It is Thursday, September 10th. Excuse me, Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? No, it's Thursday, September 10th. And we're here talking with Dr. Karen Ross. She is a professor at UMass Boston. She's in their conflict resolution program and specializing in dialogue. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to tell us about your work at UMass or the program, but feel free to fill in some of your resume for us.
All right. Thank you, John. It's great to be here with you. As you said, I am a faculty member in the conflict resolution program at UMass Boston. I do a lot of work around the impact of dialogue and grassroots peace building programs, also research on peace education in mostly in out of school settings. And I also am a practitioner of dialogue and a facilitator of dialogue. So I'm really excited to be talking about some of that work with you today.
Great, thank you. But before we get started, one of our values at All Aces is collective care, and that means we just touch base with one another, see how we're doing. We talked earlier this summer, and I don't think I've seen you since. Is there anything fun or exciting that you'd like to share with us that you've been up to in between?
Well, let's see. My spouse and my 8- and 6-year-old and I summited Mount Greylock this, I guess, about a month ago. So that was pretty exciting, especially for the kids. Bagging the highest peak in Massachusetts. So we all enjoyed that. I hope you've also been having a good summer, John.
I have. My wife and I moved to the seacoast after I retired. For those of you who don't know, I'm a retired police chief who has dove deep into racial equity work as part of what I do, what I had been doing, and I'm fortunate enough to work at All Aces Inc. as the director of partnerships here. So I've been walking on the beach with my wife and enjoying bike riding. If you don't ride your bike on the seacoast, you have a headwind no matter which way you go. So it's always challenging. And I'm curious, because we're talking about dialogue, what is the difference between what we're talking about right now, just talking, and dialogue? Is this dialogue or is this just talking?
It could be dialogue. I would say in its current permutation, probably not. So let's see. I think the primary difference between the conversation we've just been having and dialogue is really about the intention. So when I think about dialogue, I think about it not so much as, or really different from a conversation where we're just talking to each other and exchanging ideas or exchanging information, which is really what we were doing now. But instead, a kind of conversation where the focus is on moving towards mutual understanding and shared meaning, reflection. The word dialogue, actually, interesting fact of the day, comes from a Greek word, dialogos, which means through meaning, right? So this idea of creating meaning together is really central to dialogue as a process. And, that differentiates it from something like debate, right? Where you're trying to press a particular point and win points. A discussion where you're, again, just exchanging information, or even where you're exchanging ideas, but still trying to maybe convince someone of something. And certainly different from other kinds of conflict resolution tools like mediation or negotiation, where the focus is on an actual material outcome. So dialogue really focused on, again, mutual understanding, reflection, creating equitable spaces for that kind of shared meaning generation, and building relationship. Right. So some of that is in our conversation now. Learning about one another is relationship building, but that's only a part of what dialogue is.
Right. So oftentimes people will think that it's about talking and listening. And you and I have spoken a few times before this. So it's not just about talking, and it's certainly not about talking to respond, but it's about talking to listen, reflect, and then perhaps respond. Is that correct? That listening and then reflecting is almost as important as just conjuring up your response? That would be more of a debate type technique.
Yeah, well, I would say actually, my personal view on dialogue is that the listening part is actually far more important than the responding part. Although, I guess you need to have a balance there, right? If the goal of dialogue is shared meaning and building understanding of one another, you obviously need to express your ideas. But I think the real transformation that can happen through dialogue is through the listening part, And that means really opening yourself up to hear what it is, what other people are saying in a way that's not about responding immediately, right? So if you're in a dialogue context and someone is speaking, really being conscious of trying to understand the meaning of what is being said rather than immediately trying to think about what is it that I'm going to say in return. For example, somebody says something that you might feel really defensive about, right? You know, certainly in the context of racial equity work and in racial justice focused dialogues, there are a lot of moments of confrontation and possibilities for getting defensive about what somebody has said. But I think what distinguishes dialogue in that case is, you know, creating a space where people have the capacity, really, where there is a space for them to sit back and think about what has been said and try to understand it rather than listening to understand rather than listening to respond. And certainly this can happen in informal contexts as well as in sort of like a formal dialogue as a intervention. But you know, I think one of the things that is very helpful about dialogue processes is that there's a setup for that kind of listening to occur. You know, ground rules to shape the conversation, often a facilitator whose job it is primarily to hold that space and to make sure that that kind of listening can happen, and to help create kind of connections between what is being said by different people to build that shared meaning.
Interesting. So right now there's some conversations that need to happen in our country, it seems like. Perhaps.
Yes.
There's a lot of people protesting in the streets. There's a lot of people who are responding to those protests in varying ways. And before I talk about that, I'm really interested in when people do agree to come into conversation with one another, when they do agree to create some ground rules to meet. What do you do when one would be seen as the power group and one would be seen perhaps as the non-power group? So not specific, but when those two folks do agree that we have a difference that we want to resolve, and one traditionally has had it their way, so to speak, and another group is objecting to that, is there a way to level set the playing field, at least within that arena, so that this conversation can occur? And if you can't do that, you know, can it really occur? Is there true dialogue that's going to happen between folks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I spent a lot of time researching dialogue, spending time with organizations that have engaged in dialogue processes between groups. A lot of my work has taken place in Israel with groups that bring together Jewish and Palestinian citizens. And this is kind of an ongoing question of how do you create a space for equitable dialogue between groups when the group dynamics are so imbalanced outside of that space, right? And I don't think that it's not, you know, I'm an academic, so I'm going to say it's not a black and white answer, right? Mm-hmm. But I will say there are ways to kind of promote a more equitable space. Part of it is setting ground rules, right? One of the things that I really appreciated in the last, I think actually this was something that first started being discussed about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that dialogue spaces are in some ways considered safe spaces, right? Mm-hmm. The idea being that people feel vulnerable, able to share, authentic in that space. But I think it was 2013, there was a chapter published that made this distinction between safe spaces and brave spaces, which is something that I think is really relevant to these kinds of conversations. And the distinction that was made was about safety being feeling comfortable, and what is really needed in these brave spaces, which is to feel okay about the discomfort, right? And when we're talking about dialogue between, you know, privileged and groups of privileged and marginalized individuals, or individuals who have identities that have traditionally been privileged or marginalized in some way, then this goes back to actually what I was saying before about like sitting with the defensiveness, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not about creating a space where people who are privileged in relationship to the individuals from the kind of more marginalized group they're in dialogue with get to just continue to feel comfortable. It's about creating a space, and this is where ground rules are really important, right? That everyone kind of agrees at the outset, all right, we're creating someone I work with a lot in dialogue calls it holding the container, right? That we have this space, this container that we're in now in the dialogue, where we're agreeing that we're going to be uncomfortable, and that's going to be part of it. But that discomfort isn't about, again, it's not about immediately jumping to the reaction, the defensive reaction that we want not that we want necessarily, but that might be instinctively how we respond to something. And a facilitator, again, plays a really important role in reminding the group of those norms, community norms, those ground rules that they've all agreed to, right? That we've agreed that, for example, the impact of what somebody says is more important than, it has more kind of relevance in this discussion than the intention, right? So being responsible and owning up to something that might have been said that made someone else feel, that impacted someone else in a negative way. Mm-hmm. For example, really speaking for oneself is a really kind of core part of, not just dialogue processes, but certainly dialogue processes, right? You're trying to engage your own personal experiences rather than speaking as part of a collective necessarily. So, I mean, I would say, in more direct answer to your question, in terms of creating that kind of more equitable space, it is possible with a good facilitator and with what I would call brave space norms rather than safe space norms, although I think it's a little bit of a semantic distinction, right? It's more about the idea behind them, that the people who are coming into that dialogue are making a commitment to discomfort and to being challenged on things that they might have been taking for granted for their entire lives, or maybe not their entire lives, but certainly, in terms of their dominant identities.
Sure. So, and I appreciate you calling them brave spaces, because to be brave often takes vulnerability, and it takes people being willing to let down guards. I believe Brene Brown is sort of one of our rock stars in this space, and she talks about courage, and she defines it as speaking with your whole heart. And it takes, so interestingly, usually folks who are asking for change, who want to see progress, they're asking for things to be different. And I know that a lot of the resistance to change is because the other group tends to want to preserve. They have a lot of investment in the way things were, the way things are. And it was actually Ashok Panakar, if anybody who's watching has watched our previous broadcasts, Ashok mentioned when you're having these dialogues, what is it? Everybody talks about change. But he also entered the question, what is worth preserving? What is valuable of a tradition or of something of the past? And I think it's the discomfort of knowing that you have to give some of that up that makes it uncomfortable for those folks to come to the table. And people have said, if you're really going to make progress, it's going to be the extreme discomfort. The discomfort makes you move, because just like a flame, you don't want to be close to it. It's uncomfortable. So you're going to move away and you're going to move to somewhere new. So sort of the fire that's created in these conversations can, hopefully it's not an actual fire, but I'm curious. So that was a lot to say. So the vulnerability that it takes to sort of let down your guard, be open to new information, to listen to what people want for change, but also to have the space in which we can talk about preservation, like what tradition, what history is worth preserving in that space. And I'm not even sure that I have just formulated a question rather than a statement, but I'm curious you'll just respond to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it makes me think of a couple of things. First, yes, absolutely. I think the discomfort of hearing things, right? But one thing I didn't say before that I think is really important for thinking about the role of dialogue is the connection of personal experience, right? So it's not just that you're hearing something that makes you uncomfortable. It's also perhaps that you're hearing somebody's personal story that resonates with you in a way that slogans don't, or policies don't, or the news 2-minute soundbite on the news about some issue doesn't, right? It's very different, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example now, right? To like hear something about COVID-19 and the effects of having COVID-19 in a 2-minute clip on CNN or whatever, whatever news media you choose to follow. It's very different from hearing someone talk about their experience, having had COVID-19 or having a family member or loved one, right, experience the illness for themselves, right? So that kind of personal link to people's personal experience, I think, is a really powerful aspect of dialogue, perhaps the most powerful dimension of dialogue. And again, I mean, I think that's what makes dialogue really unique in the sense that we don't usually get to that kind of vulnerability, sharing of personal experience in our everyday conversations. Certainly not about the kinds of issues that, come up around racial injustice, where, people are out in the street protesting and someone else is maybe there's a group counter protesting and there's often a fair amount of yelling or like shoving signs at each other kind of thing happening, and not the opportunity to hear why it is that people feel so strongly about an issue, right? And it's not that we feel strongly about something because, we saw the sign at the rally. It's because of some personal connection that we have. So that's, I think, one aspect of it, and connecting that to this piece, this statement or comment about preservation and change. The other part of dialogue is also, the other, I think, key aspect of dialogue is that, when you have that opportunity to hear why things are so important to people, it's also an opportunity to hear what's important to people about preservation, or, not just what's important about change, right? And again, going back to this original Greek etymology of dialogue as about through meaning or creating shared meaning, it's about possibly finding some connections there and understanding, right? I mean, what is it that is so important to someone that they don't want to give up, and I'm certainly not suggesting that it becomes we revert to the status quo. But I think, if we think about dialogue as a process that can lead to action, that understanding also creates the spaces for finding openings for connection and for thinking about what it might mean to move forward together in a way that meets the needs of, the change agents and the preservation agents.
Right. So this brings up a word that is new to me over the last few months, but apparently not to you or your students, but it's superordinate goals. Superordinate goals.
Yep.
So my understanding is superordinate goals are as different as you and I may be, or the two sides talking. There are things that they have in common. There are things that they both agree are important, usually children, right? Having a safe and healthy space for our children to live. No matter how different people are, they both can agree that that's something important. Is superordinate goals the place where people begin to find that common ground with each other? Is that one of the techniques, or is that something that you would use as a dialogue facilitator to help people get to see the humanity in one another, to find the common ground, the common space, to start a conversation about their differences by starting with their similarities?
I think it really depends on the dialogue. And the reason I say that is that, you know, even though the goal of dialogue is really, the process, right? Relationship building and not some sort of concrete outcome, there are different reasons why you might come into a dialogue. And there are different contexts in which you might come into a dialogue, right? So there are a lot of dialogues that happen, for example, I'm thinking again in the Israeli context. There are a lot of dialogues that happen to just create a space for people who do not typically engage at all, right? Like there's a large amount of, like, Israel is a very segregated society. So it's a lot of dialogues that occur with the primary purpose of creating an opportunity for Jewish and Palestinian citizens to interact. Now, those kinds of dialogues are not going to lead to transformation at a systemic level, right? They're not going to change Israeli society. And there's been a lot of criticism of them, that they focus mostly on, like, oh yeah, we like the same, we learn through the dialogue that we like the same kind of music, or we have some other similarities, or we care about our kids, right? That's not necessarily actually focusing on understanding the issues that will lead to systemic change. But I think there's value in those kinds of dialogues as well, because there is a humanizing effect of, as you said, right? I mean, even just interacting with someone once and hearing about them as an individual, hearing their personal stories, creates a very different impression than just, hearing about that group, those other people, on the news or from friends or family members and so on. But I don't think that if we're thinking about dialogue as a tool for really helping address deep-seated inequalities and conflicts, it's really not enough. I think it's a starting point, but it's insufficient. So as I think about dialogue, particularly in the context of racial equity work, racial justice work, I wouldn't go into that kind of a dialogue saying that my starting point or my goal was to, focus on shared, similarities between the dialogue participants.
Right. Oftentimes we'll see people in power, they could be mayors or police chiefs, go into the communities that are perhaps protesting them or unsatisfied with the way they've been treated. And they'll come out and say, wow, I didn't know that thing, this personal story that's been told to me. And that is interesting, and it doesn't always move to change. And I'm curious, what is the difference between individual dialogue, one-on-one conversations, and group dialogue? Like a group of folks have I don't know if this is the right word, but an agenda. They have an idea of where they would like things to go. And then another group of folks have an idea of where they don't want things to go, or perhaps the way things have been. There's a difference. There's a difference between you and I, and there's a difference between this group and this group having a conversation in the scope of the world of dialogue. And I was wondering if you could sort of differentiate those to some degree for me.
So I think it really has to do with what we think about our goals in terms of change or transformation. So you and I can have a dialogue, right? I mean, we don't even necessarily need a facilitator. If we are coming in to a dialogic conversation where we really are coming in open to really being vulnerable and listening to one another and so forth, that experience, I think, can lead to transformation, kind of self-transformation that is really important, right? That might be the kind of experience that someone has that leads them to say, you know what? I have a much better understanding of kind of my place in this system of white supremacy that this country is founded on, and lead them to then engage in, I don't know, more reflection, other discussions, action, activism for change. But I think that is, just kind of like the first level of transformation, right? So what differentiates that from, for example, one of the things that you and I have spoken about before are police community dialogues.
Mm-hmm.
And a kind of more formal process where a group of law enforcement officers in a community and community members come together. That it could be just about hearing one another's stories and perspectives, leading to that kind of individual transformation. But I think also the power of the collective is real, and the power of the collective is important, right? Because that group can, end a dialogue or end a series of dialogue sessions with the desire or the intention to then actually engage together in some sort of collective change effort, right? That might be about changing the nature of law enforcement's interactions with community members at a systemic level, right, in that community, right, so that it becomes like kind of built into policy or whatever. I mean, I don't know a tremendous amount about law enforcement, so you probably have a better idea of the kinds of things that this could potentially lead to, right? And that isn't going to happen, or it might not happen directly in the dialogue, but through a process, through probably not a single session, but say a series of 3 or 4 or 6 sessions, there is enough kind of relationship built within that group, enough understanding, hopefully, and trust built within that group, that there's then a space for the next step, which is thinking about, all right, now how might we act together? Now, I'm not going to say that this is going to happen every time, right? Dialogue groups also fall apart. So it's not a kind of panacea that you start with dialogue and then we're going to resolve all our conflicts, because if that were the case, I think we'd be in a different space than we are right now. But I think that is really the difference in how I see, kind of individual level, one-on-one dialogue, which still is, again, really important, and needs maybe more formal collective efforts.
Right. So in police dialogues that I've seen, at least, police community, there's sometimes listening sessions that I've seen, which to me reflect a little bit of a power dynamic. It's like a table that's set up with police officials sitting at it. There's a crowd of people before them or beneath them, and there's got a little bit of a royalty feeling to it. Yeah. And it's a sort of a Q&A. I think it's important. I think that showing up and saying we're here to listen is important, but it's not always a panacea. People get to vent, but if there's no change, then it really can actually do more damage than good. Right. I've also seen a forum in New Hampshire. It was called New Hampshire Blue and You. And it was groups of citizens and it was groups of officers, and it was more about superordinate relationships. And so there were a lot of facilitated conversations guided toward finding our commonality. If you've had a parent who's been sick, go stand over here. And if you have a child who struggled with this, go stand over there. And people found that we had a lot in common with one another. And then that created a space where people could then say, and this concerns me about what I see. And could you tell me more about that? And that was a pretty meaningful conversation where I've struggled, and I'll come into my question for you to some degree, or at least a place where we can have a conversation, is there are people who are resistant. There's just some folks who are open to it. There are some folks who are just not willing to do that. And at All Aces, we look at racial equity work as a growth of a human. We look at people's evolution as humans, that they are able to fully be themselves. And oftentimes, if you're unable to evolve as a person, you're also unable to evolve through your racial equity work, your racial equity lens. I personally am a huge fan of a man named Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy. They're Harvard people who look at the development of the adult mind. There's also some work in what's called fixed and growth mindsets. And I'm curious because in reflecting back on folks that I've dealt with in my career, both within police work and folks within community, there are people who would have what's called a socialized mind, that they're belonging to this group. Their entire identity is wrapped around belonging to this group, as opposed to somebody who has what Keegan and Leahy would call a self-narrating mind. They're able to be a little bit more of a critical thinker and question, why do I belong to this group? And what do I really believe in? I know the group believes in this, but what do I believe in? And those folks who are critical thinkers tend to be able to wrestle with the complexities that maybe somebody else has a different perspective on things.
Mm-hmm.
Then they've got this self-transcendent mind, which is seeing yourself kind of in the matrix of the world. It's way above I'm pretty sure I'm not there, but I know about it intellectually. But in dialogue, in having conversations with folks, depending on how developed they are as humans, how seriously does that affect your ability to kind of move the conversation and the ball forward when you're dealing with people, depending on how really latched on to the group and the traditions and the belief systems as part of their identity. If I let go of that, then who am I? And how do you create an environment where it is safe, it is brave, actually, to be able to let go of that for a moment, hear a different perspective, see a different way of being, and sit in that gray area. And I too am semi-academic as well, so I don't mind dealing with gray. Everything doesn't have to be black and white. And create a space where folks it's okay to sort of let go of your latching onto your social beliefs, your ideologies, and actually consider that there is another way to think, another way to be, and that might be equally as valuable and as worthy of respect.
Yeah.
I'm not sure there's a question in there. That might be another statement.
I think part of what you're asking is about, it seems like there's two questions, actually. One is how or whether can dialogue kind of help shift people? Perhaps I'm going to stick with the fixed and growth mindsets terminology because I'm a little familiar with it. And also, kind of what happens if somebody is not able or somebody doesn't shift in the dialogue. So I'm going to answer the second question first. And I'm going to answer it by saying actually that, one of the things that's really important about dialogue is that everybody is there by choice, right? So this is both benefit in the sense that, you come into a space where everybody can, hopefully willingly, openly agree to these communication norms or ground rules that have been set. And that, kind of sets the stage for more complex understanding, listening for understanding, and so forth. The disadvantage of it is that it is, you're not going to get people into the dialogue who are opposed to having the dialogue to begin with, right? And that's one of the really big challenges about scaling up this work, dialogue work, in terms of, thinking about moving it from those people who are already willing and interested in engaging and solving problems together and, kind of coming up with collaborative approaches to moving forward. And those people who are, let's say, on the kind of extreme end of the preservation, the preservation side of the continuum. So I think, in terms of, what do you do with someone who's in a dialogue like that? I have not actually, to be totally honest, been super successful in dialogues I facilitated with addressing that kind of situation. I think, again, if you're not kind of coming into it open to being part of it, then that's going to really shape the experience for an individual, and it might also really shape the group dynamic, right? And I'll come back to that in a second. The other question was, I actually forgot what the first part of the question. I don't know. I think I made a statement. I don't know. What can dialogue do to help address it? I'm not sure. I think.
Well, so we can we'll come back because I don't remember what my first question was either. But I'm interested when you have groups in conversation. There are some people in the group with a growth mindset, and there are some people probably with a fixed mindset.
Right.
That then creates conflict within their own group. And never mind their conversation with the other group. Now their own group has a conflict. What dynamics or so you are also tied to conflict resolution. So I'm going to throw this right on your shoulders.
Right.
What techniques, skill sets, do they need to now break away from their conversation with the other group and resolve their own differences? Exile certain people from this conversation? I mean, how do you, I mean, it sounds like it can get very complicated.
Yeah, it can get very confrontational too. And I mean, I say generally we don't exile people from dialogue, although if people are, I mean, with the exception of if someone really is just not able to commit to the ground rules, right? Or will not, or continues to break them. But we don't generally exile people. It's kind of, defeats the purpose, right? But I will say that in response to what you just were saying, that I think, if we're thinking about dialogue now as a kind of more, not just an informal conversation between like you and I or two people, but in a kind of, explicit formal dialogue space between individuals who fit into, some set of privileged, marginalized groups, that the dialogue can't just be across those two groups, right? There has to be space there for what's often referred to, especially in the context of an interracial dialogue or racial justice work, affinity groups, right? So there's got to be opportunities also for, individuals who are all part of, a dominant group identity. So, white people for, if we're talking about interracial dialogues, that they're also dialoguing among themselves, right? Because there are generally, just as you said, there are people whose like entire identity is wrapped around belonging to some specific group, and then individuals who are kind of able to examine that aspect of their identity more critically or think beyond it. There are also a lot of perspectives within groups, right? Not just across groups. So, I'm just thinking about some of the kind of anti-racism work I do that's not necessarily about dialogue, but we're all committed to the work and we all have really different ideas about how to go about it sometimes or how to respond to one another. And there can be a lot of conflict within our own kind of within ourselves. So I think, a really important dimension of dialogue that's happening is that there are explicit opportunities for, maybe a pause in the dialogue across groups and opportunities for intra-group dialogue. Or, if there's a dialogue series that's built around, 6 sessions, that there's opportunities between those sessions for caucus groups or affinity groups or so forth. And I would say not even in dialogue, not just in dialogue work, right? So if we're talking about addressing race dynamics in a workplace, in an organization, in some other context, it's also part of creating, and I'm going to use the same term in a different way, safe spaces, right? In the kind of original thinking of the term, that there are opportunities, especially for individuals who have a marginalized identity in some way, to kind of be able to reflect together, or to, collectively interact around that without without other people who are gonna, respond to their experiences in a different way. But certainly within dialogue context, that could be a really, I think, powerful opportunity for, different perspectives to be voiced within a group. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot recently, actually, that in some ways stands in tension with what I just said, but I think is really important, is that we tend to think about dialogue between groups as dialogue between members of two groups, an in-group and an out-group, white people, people of color, people who identify as men, people identify as women, people identify as Christian, people identify as having a kind of minority religious identity. People identify, so whatever the kind of social identity structure that the dialogue is occurring around. But people are more than just a single thing, right? So I'm white, I'm Jewish, I'm a woman, I'm, there's a whole bunch of different identities that I'm bringing into any space I go into. And if I'm in a dialogue that is interracial dialogue, then I belong to the majority or the dominant privileged group in that dialogue in some ways, but in other ways, I might have shared experiences with other women in that group or other individuals who I don't identify as Christian, right? Or, a whole lot of, so kind of when we think about dialogue, it's often kind of about these two groups. And I think it's important to also give some thought to the intersectional identities that we all have, right? And think about how that's also a force for deepening our understanding of one another, right? This goes back to also even what you were saying before about like looking for similarities.
Yes.
So, I said it's not enough, but I do think it's even in dialogue that is focused around like the goal of the dialogue is to address issues of conflict between two groups. It's a really important part of building trust within the group, building relationships within the group to better understand the individuals who you're in dialogue with. And the kind of intersectional piece, I think, is a big component of that.
Right. Yes. As you were talking, I was thinking intersectionality. This is intersectionality all day. Yeah. That just because you might belong to the dominant group in one sense, you might not in another sense. And so, and it isn't as plain as the in group and the out group. For some people, I mean, I am a white middle-aged man. I mean, I'm kind of in the in group, and there's not a lot about me that's in the out group. So, however, like you said, the being a woman or being gay or being of a different religion, suddenly you're starting to intersect with the diversity that people talk about, and I think that that's important. I have been a member of an affinity group learning about racism, and it's an important thing to do. In New Hampshire, there is a race and equity series that is supported by the New Hampshire Endowment for Health, where they work on enhancing racial issues within New Hampshire for all people, and it could be healthcare, education, housing. I happen to be part of a law enforcement and criminal justice think tank on the issue, but the leaders in New Hampshire felt as though it was very important for white allies to come into those conversations with a basis of knowledge, so that the burden was not placed upon people of color within those groups to then educate them. So I think that there is a lot of value in having affinity groups who work together to learn what they need to learn before we start to create spaces where we begin to have in groups and out groups, or where intersectionality occurs, because then people understand those terms. They are much less likely to be microaggressive towards one another, and to do the things that will cause conflict within that group rather than enhance that group's cause.
Right. Yeah. And this actually, it kind of brings me back to a couple of things that we were saying earlier. Yes, I think you were asking, kind of earlier in the conversation about what can be done within dialogue groups to reduce the inequalities or inequities between the groups, right? That address the power imbalances. Mm-hmm. And I do think that affinity groups, or however, caucuses or whatever you want to call them, at the outset, like even before dialogue occurs across groups, is really important for that. In fact, one of the organizations that I have done a lot of work with in Israel that does this kind of work moved from a model where they were bringing young people together primarily for intra-group dialogue or intergroup experiences, to a model where most of the work is actually being done in uninational, right? Like in single identity groups. And a big reason for this is, and I know this is something we've talked about before, right? There's a lot of a need for members of dominant groups to be educated, right? Like, we see the world through the lens of our own experiences. Well, it's very easy for us to just not understand at all the experiences of individuals who have a different, way of moving through the world. And so spending some time kind of reflecting on that, getting a better understanding within ourselves as part of an affinity group is really important, so that the burden is not placed on people of color. Again, if we're talking about interracial dialogue, when we go into that space, and then creating a more kind of equitable dynamic within the dialogue itself. And, I think the more that we have opportunities to do that, I think also affinity groups for people of color are also opportunities for, I'm going to translate now from my experience in Israel. So I think it's not 100%, it's relevant, but it doesn't exactly match the context here. For dialogue groups in Israel that bring together young people in particular, kind of the dominant narratives in Israeli society don't necessarily lead to, and actually this is relevant to the United States, like the education system in the United States doesn't teach primarily, like public education mostly teaches a white version of history, right? And like pretty much everything that we could think about. So there's a lot of work being done to change that. But just as, one example of the way that we live in a, society that's dominated by white history, culture, and it's kind of based on white supremacy and everything, that in some ways, it means that there's fewer opportunities for people of color to I don't know how to say this in a way. I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like that sounds right. That's actually expressing what I want to say. That opportunities for young people to think about how they can collectively be part of a group that has power, right? Where in the dominant narratives in society, they're mostly seeing themselves as a group that doesn't have power. That's also really important, because then you come into a dialogue knowing that you're part of something that you have power as a group. And if the contact, if you're engaged in a situation where, you're responding to individuals who are part of privileged group in society, then having that opportunity as a kind of affinity group of your own to feel like your own power is amplified in some way, right? I think is really important. That didn't come out exactly right, but I hope that you got the gist of it.
I do. In all ACEs, we would call, it would bleed into one of our values, and we call that collective care. And we started out by asking each other how we were doing. And there is tremendous value. And we just had an internal conversation the other day about the role of self-development in racial equity work, and how much I can progress as a human being will put limitations on or expand my ability to progress and enhance racial equity. And so we talked about the importance of growing as a person. And one of my coworkers said, yeah, that's what we would call the work. And often in racial equity, they call it the work. Right. And I think a lot of other people think of the work as trying to convince everyone else that you should believe these things. You should believe what I believe. You should believe that this is important. And that can be exhausting. It can be really exhausting. And I think within those affinity groups where you have collective care for one another, where you're helping each other learn and grow, and you're enhancing your own racial equity journey together, that work is the real work that will help you gain power and help you progress and enhance racial equity in your own world, and then hopefully you can convince some people to come along the way with you. But it was an interesting paradigm about what's the work, one version of the work and another version of the work. So I found that interesting. And I guess I'll just say this, we oftentimes will work with leadership and then middle level management and then line workers or frontline workers in organizations. And what we tend to find is there's a lot of diversity at the bottom, with all our frontline employees, and companies will pride themselves on having diversity. But as you go up, it becomes much more homogenous. It becomes more white. It becomes more male. It becomes more middle-aged as you get to the top of that pyramid. And so we will work with those different affinity groups to help them sort of frame and understand a conversation before we then bring them together to hear a lot of the complaints that have fallen on deaf ears or not even had a mechanism or a process to reach the top. So that is a lot of the work that we do at All Aces. It's not necessarily about definitions and if you say the right thing, everything will be okay. But it's about how do you create a conversation so that all voices are important, are heard, valued, and they go into the process of creating a more equitable organization or world for that matter.
Right. So it makes me think of what you were saying earlier about the kind of listening sessions, right?
Yes.
That sometimes happen in, kind of police community relations, where, a listening session is really a one-way street, or maybe not. I don't know exactly what you're thinking of, but it seems to me that it's an opportunity for community members to kind of air their grievances, right? But
yes.
In a way that kind of thing can often result in the people who hear those grievances and, to make the connection to what you're just talking about within organizations, line workers airing their grievances and then going up to middle management and the kind of executive, they can hear it, right? But then it's kind of a unilateral decision about what to do with that. And so if we're thinking about this as a more dialogic approach, which is what I know, All Aces is, sounds like you're doing, right, is creating an opportunity for the conversation to include everybody, right? So if you're working with each one of those groups separately, to prepare that space. And then, the dialogue is really happening already on a different level where there is, a commitment to a process where everybody has an opportunity to be listened to, right? But also where perhaps decision-making processes are going to be based on this collective working together to create change. And again, that's the step after the dialogue itself. But it looks very different than, what we think of as traditional ways of dealing with conflicts that occur, in organizations or in communities, between communities and law enforcement and so forth and so on.
Yes. I think the thing that you were hitting on is we can hold listening sessions, we can hold truth and reconciliation sessions, and the purpose is to hear and record a history that was denied to people. And you talk about how we're rewriting and reteaching some of the history that's been very whitewashed over the years to our students. And that is about hearing and recording and publishing a history that has been denied to many of minoritized communities. I think where we fall down and where the problem is when people in power hold those thinking, well, we're going to hear these grievances, but then don't make substantive changes to address those grievances so that they continue over and over and over again, then you're doing more harm than good. There's a book by, I'm going to screw the name up, but it's called Reframing Organizations. It's by Bowman and Deal. Look at that. I thought of it.
Okay.
And there's a frame in there called the symbolic frame. And it's about not necessarily what we say, but what we do, or it's all the symbolism that goes into our actions. So we can say we care, we can hold a listening session that shows that we care. But if we don't make a change and the things that have harmed continue to harm, then the symbolic message is we don't really mean what we say. We're gonna tell you we're gonna do this stuff, and then but our actions are proving differently. And so I think, as you mentioned, dialogue can only take us so far, and from there, we really need to have actions that make the changes that create a more equitable society.
Absolutely, but I think that the power of dialogue is that you might say, okay, we're going to listen, and then in the dialogue, if you're really listening to understand, you might experience that. I guess you were talking about it earlier as a flame that you want to move away from. But I would say, as something that really resonates with you in a very powerful way. And that might be the impetus for you to then engage in that change. Or, I think even at a protest, this could happen. Like if a dialogue can happen between a protester and a counter protester that can really shift things for that individual, that kind of leads someone to reflect on things differently. And as a result of that reflection, to shift in their own thinking, and then from there to shift in their actions as well. So don't discount the value of like just hearing something, right? But absolutely, it's not enough. You need to go beyond that in order for change to actually happen, certainly at a collective level.
Right. And I think there's a lot of examples throughout time where we've seen people who seem to be in conflict, and even in protests, somebody will fall down and be hurt. And before you know it, there are people from the side that's not on their side, helping them get up, making sure they're not injured, and helping them to be cared for. And I think that seeing the humanity in one another is so important. There's so many wedges being driven in there. And I talked about flame before, wanting to move away. We want to move away from discomfort, but flame can give us warmth too. And sometimes it's important to move toward the warmth, and maybe that's the warmth of one another. So we're running out of time here. I don't know if you have any parting words for our audience, but I want to thank you so much for joining us here at All Aces on Air. I'm John Monaghan, Director of Partnerships. We will continue to run these series. This is Dr. Karen Ross. And if you have parting words or thoughts, please feel free to share them.
Mostly just want to say thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. And I'll end by saying that, kind of the interest in dialogue and the commitment that I'm seeing to it and to dialogue and context is also it's a cause for hope. And as I know has been said before, that's a really important part of getting us from where we are to where we want to be. So I will end with that. And thank you so much for having me with you today.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. It was our pleasure, as always. And yes, that was Marie Breen Smith. Never lose hope. Even when there is no hope, believe in hope, because it will come. And I have faith in humanity, and I'm sure that we are all going to be in a better place sometime soon. All right. Take care, everyone.